All right, in this video, we're going to wrap up Brown v. Board of Education, and we're going to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement. So in the last lesson, we talked about Brown v. Board of Education and how that decision is going to overturn that concept of separate but equal facilities for whites and African Americans. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other challenges to the desegregation of schools. So Marshall and the NAACP are going to continue to challenge the South segregation laws. So remember those Jim Crow laws that are going to require separate facilities for whites and African Americans. So there are two types of segregation. So the first is de jure segregation, which is based on race and is intentional by law. And then de facto segregation, which is based on private choices or lingering social consequences of legal segregation. So de facto segregation is going to be more difficult to address, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in these next two cases. So these cases are not required for the AP exam, but they do a good job of illustrating the effects of Brown v. Board of Education. So the first one is Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education from 1971. So in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, North Carolina, approximately 14,000 Black students are going to attend schools that were either totally Black or 99% Black. So the school system is going to try to experiment with different solutions, okay, including the busing of African American students to other schools to try to desegregate schools. So even if it meant sending students to schools further away from their home. So the lower courts had experimented with a number of solutions before this case actually gets to the Supreme Court. And in this case, the court is going to rule that the busing and the use of transportation to desegregate schools, even if it meant sending students to schools further away from their home, is in fact constitutional. So those who are in favor of this type of desegregation are going to argue that that busing is necessary due to the deep roots of segregation that had been happening in the South. This next case is Milliken v. Bradley, and this is going to take place in 1974. So again, this is more de facto segregation. So this case is going to involve educational segregation that's caused by residential housing patterns in and around Detroit. So in the middle of the 20th century, millions are going to move to the suburbs. So a large number of whites are going to move outside of the city center, where the urban cores are going to be left with a high percentage of African Americans who live there. Okay, so a large number of whites have moved outside of the city. African Americans remain living in the city. So segregation is going to go from being maintained by law, okay, requiring separate facilities, to being between urban and suburban school districts. Okay, so it's not segregation by law, but based on those housing patterns, okay? So the schools in the suburbs are going to have a larger number of white students because that's where they live, whereas the schools in the urban area, that urban core, is going to have a larger number of African American students because that's where they live. So there's this question of, should the court take action? And they are going to rule that schools would not be ordered to desegregate because the district boundaries had not been drawn on the purpose of segregation. Okay, so they were not purposely segregating schools in this case. It's just how it happened based on where people lived. All right, moving into the civil rights movement. Okay, so you all are probably aware with some of the things that we're going to be discussing in this part of the unit. So the Supreme Court decisions that we've talked about so far did not end segregation in the South. Okay, so citizens are going to start taking increasingly strong action to end segregation, which is going to result in this larger social movement. Okay, so you've probably heard about Martin Luther King Jr. for a long time in your educational career. So we're going to be talking a little bit about him. So the mid-1950s are really going to mark this turning point in American society. African Americans who had been the subject of discrimination, okay, including violence and other mistreatment, are really going to push for change. Okay, they are going to organize and take a collective action to persuade state and local governments to change their policies. And they're really going to do this by civil disobedience. And we're going to talk about some different examples of civil disobedience. But this is the intentional refusal to obey a law or call attention to its injustice. All right, so we're going to start by talking about Emmett Till because he is really the spark for this civil rights movement. Gets it going, gets people talking, getting them wanting to come together collectively to get the government to make changes. So Emmett Till, who you see right here, is a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago who is visiting his family in Mississippi. So it's important to note that he is from Chicago in the north, so he's not from the south. He is with his cousins and some friends, and he's going to go in a country store where he is heard saying, "Bye, baby," to the white woman behind the counter. So this woman, whose name is Carolyn Bryant, is going to claim that this 14-year-old kid is making lewd advances and whistled at her. So her husband, okay, and another family member are going to go to Till's uncle's home where he had been staying, and they're going to force him into a car. So when they do that, okay, the Bryant's husband and the men, they're going to force Till, who is again 14 years old, to carry a 75-pound cotton gin fan to the bank of a nearby river where Till is going to be beat nearly to death. His eyes are gouged out, he's shot in the head, and then he's thrown in the river and tied to the fan with a barbed wire. Okay, so 3 days later, his disfigured corpse is going to be discovered. His body is returned to Chicago, and his mother is going to decide to have an open casket funeral so the world can see. Okay, so this is his mother here. This is Emmett Till. Okay, and if you can look up other pictures because there are pictures where this was published and shown for the world to see. But when people start seeing these pictures, when they're published, okay, they are going to say, hey, this has to end. We need to do something. So Emmett Till is really going to be the spark of the civil rights movement, especially when an all-white jury is going to find the two men who did all of this to him not guilty. All right, so moving on to the Montgomery bus boycott, which is part of that civil disobedience within the civil rights movement. So in December of 1955, Rosa Parks, who is a secretary of a local NAACP chapter, she is going to refuse to give up her bus seat, okay? And when she does, she is arrested, okay? So she's refusing to give up her seat to a white rider, okay? So upon her arrest, community leaders are going to organize a bus boycott, which put economic pressure on this city to end racial segregation on buses. So this is in Montgomery, Alabama. Okay, so what happens here is when all of these people, African Americans who are riding the buses every single day, stop riding the buses, okay, the city is going to lose the money that they get for them riding those buses, okay? So this is a form of civil disobedience that's putting that economic pressure on the city. So Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be the leader of this bus boycott. So he's really going to start to become prominent here, okay? So during this time, the Black community is going to organize carpools and walk rather than ride the buses. So again, the city is losing massive amounts of revenue. So the boycott lasts for more than a year. And in a 1956 Supreme Court decision, the bus law, okay, was declared unconstitutional. All right, and that is where we are going to stop.